to go terribly, terribly wrong?
Oh, no.
For me, one of the ones that really stands out when I was a little kid, we would have competitions to see who could jump from the highest up the stairs to the bottom of the stairs. Now, naturally, it was easy to beat my brother. He was younger, he was smaller, but I had a friend named Michael. Now, when he was in high school, Michael was on the track team. But even at a young age, that dude had some long legs. He could jump. I could not jump. But if he could do it, I thought, I bet I can make it. And I recall one instance where I jumped about 8 stairs up. And I think it was about the moment that my toe began to touch the second stair from the bottom that I realized this is not going to go so great. You see, it's often right before or right as things are happening that we realize it's all about to go terribly, terribly wrong. Now in Uno, this is especially true when a certain card is about to get played. Because in my experience, no one ever plays a draw for a wild card without staring you down as they do it. No one's ever casual about a draw for a wild card. No, no, no. They're like, and as it begins to emerge from their hand, in that moment, you know that whatever plans you had are about to go terribly, terribly wrong. In the books, and then in the later film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, we learn that there are many rings of power. We learn that all the races were given a different ring of power or a number of rings for various reasons, different powers, abilities to lead. But we also learn that there is one ring, forged in secret, to rule them all. But in Uno, there is one card, kept, hidden in hand, in secret, until it is played to rule them all. Because it is the one card that can never be undone. If somebody plays a draw 2 card, and you have a draw 2 card, you can stack that card. But when a draw 4 wild comes out, it is done. It rules all of the things. It changes the game, fundamentally, for a couple of reasons. First of all, somebody has to draw 4 cards. It's a huge obstacle you have now put upon that other player. And the second reason it fundamentally shifts the game is not only do you make somebody draw more cards, but you then get to change the color. You get to shift the momentum or completely derail somebody else's momentum. A woman comes to the temple and she has been dealing with sickness and lingering chronic problems. Terrible, terrible suffering for 18 years. The synagogue was a place of learning, but it was also a place of healing. And so she comes looking for healing, but the other problem is, in Jewish society, if you have something wrong with you, you're an outsider. So you can also get healing, but you get to go to the back of the line. So she may have come for 18 years looking for healing, and every time she comes, they say, yeah, we'll get to you if we have time, but you have to go to the back, year after year. So she comes on Sabbath to worship God, despite what she's dealing with. And there's this wandering preacher in town. He seems to know a thing or two, so the local guy said, I'll take a Sunday off. Well, I'll have him preach. And in the middle of his sermon, he just stops preaching. And he sees the woman, and he goes, come on up here. I don't know about you guys, if I just stopped preaching right now, and I was like, hey, come on up. I was like, Scott, come on up here. Like, right? He just turned and did this. What? Right? He's looking down. He's probably texting. So, Never. That's right, he's not texting, he's tweeting. So, if you called somebody out in the middle of church right now, if I did that, can you imagine the panic, right? What? What am I going up front? If you've been to any show where they say, can I have a volunteer? And everyone's like, I don't want no part of what's about to happen. Right? Especially not like Cirque du Soleil. Do not volunteer at Cirque du Soleil. So he calls this woman up in the middle of a sermon. He says, how long? She's like, 18 years. And he's like, today. Gone. She straightens up and she praises God for the miracle that has happened. Places his hands on her. Says, all is forgiven. And what's the response? Is it joy and happiness? No. The pastor that took the Saturday off, we're in a synagogue. Saturday off, comes storming out of the back of the congregation like, what do you think you're doing? Don't you know what day it is? So Jesus goes, ooh, I have a new sermon now. Now we also have to understand something very important about Jewish society to understand what's going on in this text. When people had questions about things, they would go to the synagogue or the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the like, and they would ask them, hey, what do I do? And they would say, we think you should do this. And so then when there was a consensus reached in a case or in a question that was posed, they would write that down. And that kind of became their governing law book. It's like our United Methodist Book of Discipline, right? Don't gloss over. I'm not actually going to talk about the Book of Discipline, right? Bring it back. But that's what it was like. And so then when somebody came and had a question, they would say, oh, this question's been asked before. Let's go to the archives. And they'd flip through the book, or actually open the scroll, and these guys decided this. And they'd be like, cool. So at some point in the history, somebody came and said, I know we're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, but it's really hot. And my donkey needs to get water. What do I do? And initially they probably were like, the donkey will be fine for a day. But then somebody went and said, my donkey fell in a ditch. Should I leave it down there all day? Shouldn't I rescue my donkey from the ditch? And they said, yeah, you probably should pull your donkey out of the ditch. It's okay to do work if you're trying to save your donkey from the ditch. So then somebody came back and said, what if my donkey needs water? Well, they already had this exclusion built in for the ditch incident, right? So they said, well, by extrapolation, getting water for your donkey is kind of like pulling your donkey out of the ditch. And so they said, you are allowed to loose your animal on the Sabbath. Right? Loose it, untie it. They had put in an exemption. We land in our scripture for today. Jesus is teaching. It's the Sabbath. This woman is dealing with all this illness and all this suffering for 18 long years. And Jesus heals her. And the guy's like, you can't do this on the Sabbath. We're not supposed to work. Heal her on any of the other days of the week. And Jesus is real smart. And so he goes, oh, really? We're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath? Well, I happen to know that we built in an exemption for you to loose your donkey on the Sabbath in case it falls in the ditch or in case you need to get it some water. Isn't it much more important that we loose this woman from her chains of suffering? Ooh, somebody must have gone to law school. I like the idea of law school Jesus. Kind of like an action figure. But he knows. He knows. And so that's the argument he uses. Right? And then the religious leaders get mad. And why do they get mad? It's because you get mad when something happens that you can't refute. I get mad when somebody plays a draw for a wild card against me. Because I can't do anything about it. Right? Now, I actually believe there is something in the rules. This is the family that I come from. There is something in the rules that says you can't play a draw for a wild unless it's the only card you have that you can play. Important distinction. I'm pretty sure it's in there. Somebody's shaking their head at me. I'll fight you, right? No, I'm pretty sure it's in the rules, because I think that's the only way you can get out of it. They start to play it, and you're like, do you have a 6 or a yellow card? Well, yeah, then you can't play that card. And they're like, I'll skip you instead. And you're like, ah. So there is like one way out of it, but generally speaking, you can't get out of the draw for a while. And so that's what happens. I feel like as Jesus starts to speak and he starts to tell the religious leader this whole thing about the donkey and the loosing of the bounds, that's the moment the religious leader knew it was all about to go terribly wrong for him that day. It was the draw for a wild card coming out. The pettiness in myself likes to imagine Jesus staring the guy down while he says it. Didn't you untie your donkey? That's Starkey Jesus. It's a separate pack. You can't just buy Starkey, you can't buy Lawyer Jesus and Starkey Jesus in the same pack. Right? It's accessories, you got it, Amazon Prime, you can get it there. But that's not probably how he did it. To be honest, he probably said it very full of compassion while looking at the woman who he had just healed. But it was at that moment that the scribe knew that everything was about to go terribly wrong for him. And we know it does because he gets angry and everyone else rejoices. If everyone else is rejoicing and you are angry, you are probably on the wrong side of whatever is happening right there. Because the argument Jesus is making is, aren't people more important than that? Than maintaining your Sabbath law that you've already built an exemption into? Isn't this woman more important than a donkey? He's saying. Now, in our world, we have draw for wild cards. It's called oppression. It's called injustice. It's called racism. It's systemic, often. If you look in our history, you can see things like red line districts. And if you lived inside of a red line district and you went to the bank and you asked for a loan, they'd be like, where do you live? Can't give you a loan. Except that often these red line districts were based not upon income or anything of that nature. They were based upon race. They were used to keep some from accessing what everybody else had. Now, I grew up in Kansas, and in Kansas, one of the things that we're famous for is the Brown versus Board of Education court case that happened, in which it was ruled that separate but equal was not constitutional because the reality of it was that it was separate but unequal. And what happened is that as a result of that decision, the Kansas City, Missouri School District was forced to integrate, and they went broke paying for buses. Because people had been forced to live in certain neighborhoods. And this neighborhood went to that school, and this neighborhood went to that school. And wouldn't you know it, the neighborhoods were based upon race. And which school they went to was based upon which neighborhood they lived in. And so when they said you have to integrate, they said, well, but everybody lives here or there, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And they said, well, maybe if you hadn't made things real unequal in the beginning, we wouldn't be having this problem. But here we are. Systemic injustice is what holds people like this woman in our scripture from getting healing back. Why 18 years? She was an outsider. She had a problem. Nobody wanted to deal with her. So they said, you go over here and we'll ignore you. And Jesus comes and he says, I don't care about your system. All I care about is your people. Now, it's hard to hear sometimes that we are the one that played the draw for a wild card. One of the first things we did when I got to seminary, we did something called a privilege walk. And they made all of us line up in a line. And they just started asking questions. And they said, every time we ask a question, if it's true for you, take a step forward. They said, if it's not true for you, stay where you are. And if the opposite has happened to you, take a step back. And at the end of the privilege walk, it was like 30 questions. There was only one person that was farther forward than me. There was a whole lot of people that had moved backwards. Not because of anything that they had done, not because of anything that made them a better or worse person than anybody else, simply because of the systems and the structures that we exist inside of. And that's tough stuff when we have to do that self-reflection. It's tough stuff when what we think we know gets challenged by something else. So that's why the synagogue leader gets angry, because Jesus challenges the system that he knows that holds some back and advances others forward. And he says it ain't about that anymore. It ain't about the rich person that wants to make sure their donkey gets a drink of water. It's about those who are suffering. I don't care about your system. The draw for a wild card is the most dangerous card, because we often in our real lives don't see it played, even though it's played all the time. It's the card that changes up things, makes them more difficult for one person than another, makes it almost impossible for some. There was a gentleman recently who is an immigrant to this country, and every so often you have to do a check-in with Immigration Services, and he got a notification a week before his meeting, and they said, you need to go to your port of entry. And he said, well, there's an immigration office in my state that I live in. Why do I need to go to the port of entry? And the reason he was concerned is that his port of entry was New York, but he was living in Illinois. And they said, we don't really care. You just have to go to your port of entry. And it's in a week. You don't have a choice. If you miss this hearing, you'll lose your visa. You'll have to go and leave the country. And he said, I was so thankful that my employer worked with me so that I could leave on such short notice. I was thankful that I had the money to undertake a trip to go to New York. And he said, I got all the way there. I was on time for my meeting, and it was a 10-minute meeting, basically to say, hey, oh good, you had your form. They stamped me and said, you're good. And I asked, how come I had to come to New York? And they just said, I don't know. Somebody said so. A draw for a wild card was played. We play the draw for a wild card when we support systems that hold others back. And it requires to not play it, to do self-reflection on how we have had privilege in our lives, how we've lived into our privilege, and maybe how we're blind to that privilege. I would imagine that those who were in good health, who were not an outsider in Jesus' time, didn't fully recognize the privilege they had of simply being able to go to worship and not have to stand outside the synagogue, of being able to go into the market and buy food for themselves because they weren't forced to stay outside of the community. They may have never realized it, or they just said, oh, this is the way it is. Why do I want to change it? But we have to ask ourselves the tough questions of how can I work to change these things, to make things better? Because there is draw for wild cards in our midst all the time, making things more difficult for each and every other person. And if we don't do the hard work right now to recognize that privilege, that draw for wild in our life, we run the risk of becoming the synagogue leader who gets angry when somebody else gets something that we feel we're entitled to but that they're not. And if we don't do the work now, and that moment comes upon us, and we're the one who's angry, and we're the one who feels left out, that becomes the moment when we realize far too late that it's all gone terribly wrong. Because Jesus is not a God of some, but a God of all. God did not send his Son amongst us for some of the people, but for all of the people. Now, the disciples don't always get that. They're like, yeah, right, we're going to make the world better for the Jewish people. And he's like, right, all the people. And they're like, right, all the Jewish people. And he's like, no, 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 all the people. And they're like, yeah, all the Jewish people. And Jesus is like, no, all the people. They just don't get it. It takes forever for the disciples to get it. It takes a vision that Peter has after the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ for them to be like, oh, all the people. Like, because they couldn't get over the draw four wild cards that they had in their lives. So we have to wrestle and do the hard work so that we know that we are with Christ and helping those who are in need and not playing with the draw four wild card, but being unaware of our playing of it. Because Jesus will come into our midst when we least expect it and do something we don't want him to do. And our hope and our prayer is that the grace of God will bring us and move us to a place on our road towards perfection where we aren't in that space, where we aren't unaware of the movement of the Spirit, we aren't unaware of the grace of God, and we aren't unaware of where he calls us to be until it's too late. Because what he really wants us to do is do the hard look at ourselves so that we recognize before it's too late, we can't jump from 8 stairs up. We got to go down a couple steps. Because you're not going to make it. So may you do the hard work of self-examination and self-reflection so that you don't find yourself finding out just when it's too late that you made a mistake. Because God gives us the grace, the power, the glory, and the ability to take a hard look at ourselves and the world in which we live and ask, is this reflective of the kingdom of God? And if not, what can I do to make it more like that today? And that is a power that is not a secret power. It's not one power to rule them all. It is a power for us all. And that is some good news. Amen.